What an amazing time to be alive, right? Yes? Okay, it's a very faint yes, and I feel like 9 times out of 10 that I'm with an audience and I ask this question. There's a lot of caution around the room. There's a lot of pessimism. It's like no one is ready to say that this is one of the brightest spots in our history. This is an amazing time to be alive. And don't get me wrong, because mostly I'm actually here to agree with you. And in in the next few minutes, I hope I'll be able to convince you that not only is this one of the most destructive times in the history of our planet, but we're standing on the verge of the end of the world as we know it, and why I think that's a good thing. So to begin with, of course, this is a terrible period in our history. We have no one would be able to tell you this better than me. I worked with the UN Peacekeeping mission in South Sudan in about a year ago during the Second Battle of Juba. So we worked in active conflict. We saw and we heard stories of the worst kind of human rights violations, the deaths of thousands of people, a rampant sexual violence around the country. I happened to work with the Chemical Weapons Treaty Organization in The Hague at a time when horrific nerve agents like sarin were being used against children as young as infants. And sarin is a nerve gas, a drop of which, if it comes in contact with you, can make you convulse so hard that your spine snaps in half. We have 40 conflicts raging around the world today. We have one of the largest refugee crises in history. There are new forms of deprivation, new forms of weapons of mass destruction that are being used, new forms of gross human rights violations, the marginalization of communities, widespread poverty, hatred, the othering of people who live in our own communities. So, of course, it's a horrific time, but what's interesting to me is this. Ask yourself if this is really the worst time to be alive, or the worst time in our history. And what was even more interesting to me when I thought about this was how every generation that has come before us has thought that this was the worst time and that they were standing at the high noon of history. And generations had it much worse before us. I mean, do we really have it worse off than, say, the generation that stood at the eve of World War I, or the Holocaust, or the fields of Flanders in Belgium when chemical weapons were used for the first time? Do we have it worse than the fall of Assyria and Babylon? I think a lot of this is a matter of perspective. There is a reason why, as a generation, we are so convinced that this is a horrific time to be alive and this is the worst that things have ever been. And I think that's mainly because of 3 reasons. And this is not always true, it's a bit of a generalization. Firstly, a lot of business interest depends on convincing you that it's something you have to be afraid of so that you can buy the products that the market is selling. Secondly, political power. A lot of it depends on creating an enemy that is either outside your country or inside your country. War, don't get me wrong, is a great unifier. Countries rally around governments that have gone to war, and this has been observed through the breadth of our world and the length of our history. And it's not always just the enemy outside the border. Oftentimes it's creating an enemy inside your border. So if you have 2 parties fighting an election that don't really have very much different from each other in terms of their economic policies or their social policies, etc. What do? They start appealing to the ethnic or racial identity of the people who are in their constituency and who are their followers. And this has been at the core of a lot of civil conflict, not just in South Sudan where I worked, but in a lot of our civil wars are fueled by that kind of politics. So these are the 2 reasons, and the third, of course, is the news cycle. I mean, we live in a culture of breaking news. We live in a culture where we continuously scroll down Twitter and Instagram and all our social media news feeds, and you read new content every few minutes. And content, I'm sorry to say, is always things that are extraordinary. News, by its very nature, is always bad news. You can't have a violent TV debate with 10 panelists and little windows all over your screen having a shouting match about a medical breakthrough or a technological breakthrough or some progress that's been made in the alleviation of poverty. So for me, when I started thinking about these things, it was not just a matter of perspective. There were also formidable data models and a lot of analysis that has been done that shows us that this is actually a much better time in history than before. And a lot of it is just in terms of how we see the technologies that we think are destructive today are actually a good thing. For example, think about this. The Me Too movement, which has led to a lot of women calling out men in power for the violence and abuses that they have inflicted on the women who work with them and in their families, is not an indication that sexism is worse now than it was in the time of the suffragette movement, or when women didn't have the right to vote, or when in religious institutions we had debates about whether women were a species of animal or were they actually even human. The Me Too movement showed us not that sexism is worse, but now we have the tools, the technology, the political will, and the instrument to call it out in every form that it exists. Racism, racist violence, incidents of it that are on our social media news feeds, that are so easily documented, and our WhatsApp groups and our social media news feeds are full of them, are not an indication that racism today is worse than it was in the time of segregation or the apartheid or colonialism across huge parts of Asia and Africa. It's an indication that now we have the tools to document instances of racist violence, to disseminate it quickly, and to initiate immediate action against it. We have 40 active conflicts, as I said, but war is less deadly now. Fewer people have lost their lives in armed conflict in the first decade of our century than in any decade of the century that just went by. More civilians lose their lives, but war is much less deadly, and a lot less people are dying accidental deaths or in crime or through gun violence around the world. We have more nuclear weapons now, 16,000 nuclear warheads for some reason in the arsenals of countries. But the threat of an actual nuclear war is so much lower than it was at the dawn of the nuclear age or during the Cold War. We've got poverty, but extreme poverty actually declined in half under the UN's Millennium Development Goals in the last decade or so, and especially led by countries like China and India, where most of this progress was made. We have climate change. That's a new issue, right? We've not had that before in such a big way, and a lot of it is because of the way we do development. But unlike years before, now we know we have the technology and the awareness that there is renewable sources of power in our wind and in our sunlight, in our water, the way we never knew before. Our lives are healthier. We are living longer. Our life expectancy is now touching 70 around the world. Automated processes have made jobs that were earlier hazardous and we had to do with our own hands so much safer to do because now robots can do them. Technology has leapt forward in such quantum leaps. Today we are on the verge of creating artificial intelligence I'm talking about sentience out of software and wires, something that was unimaginable a few years ago. We are on the verge of our first manned interplanetary missions, interstellar missions almost. So, all of this was unimaginable before. And then to make it even better, now we have the Enlightenment behind us. We are armed with more liberal philosophies. We are armed with more democracy. There are fewer empires today. This is the most democratic the world has ever been. This is the most democratic information flows have ever been. This is the most connected we have ever been. It's so easy for us right now, if we wanted to link up by video to a small village in Iceland and listen to someone giving a TED talk there, we'd be able to do it in a second. So if I ask you that question again, is this an amazing time to be alive? It's not just for those reasons. I think a lot of it is also because now we have the instrument to tackle the same challenges that we didn't before. Let me tell you a little story of 490 BC. Let's go back in time a little bit. This is at the height of the Greco-Persian conflicts. And you've all seen 300, you know that at that time Athens and Sparta were the two biggest Greek kingdoms. I'm going to tell you the story of the Battle of Marathon. In 490 BC, a large Persian army decided to attack a small group of Athenians. And the Athenians didn't have a lot of potential to win this, except that in the way they strategized, and they actually ended up winning the battle over the course of an afternoon. And this is what they did. So you had the Greek forces, they set up the core of their defense as a decoy. So there were fewer people there, it was kind of weak. They didn't let the Persians know this. And so the Persians obviously, whenever you're attacking another army in battle, the conventional thing to do is go straight for the core, go for the vanguard first. So the Persians focused all their attention on attacking this weak decoy core that the Athenians had put up. At the same time, the Persians didn't know that the Athenians had actually strengthened their flanks on both sides. And so while the Persians were attacking them right at the center, charging straight forward and losing their soldiers, the Athenians, although they were smaller in number, started to envelop them from two sides. And as soon as the Persians realized that they had been surrounded, they began running, ran back to the coast, were completely routed, and in the course of a single afternoon, the Battle of Marathon was won. So I think while we have the same problems that we had a few decades ago, and a lot of it seems like, the gains we made by ending fascism or by winning World War I, we seem to be reversing them in many parts of the world, we actually have these problems surrounded. And the gains that we make today will be so much less easily reversed than they have ever been before. Because today we have the political will, the resources, the knowledge to do politics in a different way, to call the old guard out on its, bull, the rest of the word, I don't think I'm allowed to say it at this platform. We have the power and the technology to bring prosperity more quickly to people who are marginalized. And in my sector, I know this more than anyone else because having worked in international security and development, now you have teams of people who are using data sets, who are using predictive tools, who are using thorough analysis. Peace building used to be singing a lot of John Lennon songs holding hands. Now it's actually a lot of using data to predict which interventions will create conditions of ceasefire the quickest, what mitigation and adaptation measures are going to stop climate change from happening. So I think your generation needs a little more optimism because, God, you come into a room, you ask a question like, is this an amazing time to be alive? And you get maybe a few faint yeses. And don't even get me started on how your meme pages are so full of existentialist doom and everyone's having a crisis and, memes are getting danker from when I used to be young. So, and I think a lot of that is because of false nostalgia. So I'm here to tell you, you shouldn't let the old generation say to you that greatness lies in the past. Don't let them tell you that greatness has died with the Vikings and the gladiators and the builders and destroyers of empire, that it has died with the explorers of the free world. Because never before has a generation had the kind of capacity that you have to alter the course of history in such a decisive way. And this generation is really ready for it, because I know a lot of magazine covers are calling millennials the absolute worst. They're telling you that you're lazy and selfish and entitled and narcissistic. But I say to them, women around the world and girls, very young girls, are risking their careers, their reputations, their privacy in the Me Too movement to call out powerful men who have done violence to them. There are kids right out of university who could have, put their blinkers on and gone for a career straight to the Big Four and become investment bankers and focused on a corporate life, who are taking time off to build social ventures to help those who are the most marginalized in the communities around them. And when gun violence became out of control, children, not professional youth activists, not professional young political leaders, but children, school students, marched for their lives on Washington, D.C. at the core of power. So I don't think that this generation is going to stand by as war burns through our lands and new forms of hatred and prejudice threaten to reverse the gains that we have made in the last 1 century. I think that this generation is the most destructive that we've had in history ever. I think it's going to destroy the old guard. It is going to destroy the old world. It will be the end of history as we know it, and that's a good thing, and I can't wait. Thank you.